Hello, everybody. Welcome to this roundtable discussion that will consider Mary Prince and Equiano and many other Black Atlantic figures and lives in the diaspora from the 18th century to the present day. I'm Kerry Sinanan. I'm president of the Early Caribbean Society, and I'm an assistant professor in pre-1800 global literatures, and I focus on the literature and culture of the Black Atlantic. I'll pass you to my colleague, Olivia.
Hello, my name is Olivia Carpenter, and I'm a lecturer in literature at the University of York. I study early Black British lives and literatures.
Hello, I'm Kristina Huang. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm in the English department. I also study the early Black Atlantic world. And my first book, I'm working on a book manuscript titled Black Life Unbound, and I'm focusing on methods of reading fugitivity in early Black literature.
Hi, I'm Nicole Carr, and I'm at Texas A&M San Antonio, and I focus on issues of Black reproductive health, and I'm finishing up my book by September, and I'm happy to be here.
I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to open the panel. This talk is on the history of Mary Prince and the web of Black Atlantic print culture. And I'm going to try and situate Equiano in a wider company. Especially on this panel, we're going to be talking about Mary Prince and other Black people in the diaspora who were fighting for freedom. When the History of Mary Prince was published in London by the Anti-Slavery Society in 1831, it created a furore that galvanized the long legal battle for full emancipation of all people enslaved in the British Caribbean. It ran to 3 editions that year alone and gathered legal impetus from a complex series of court cases and testimonies from Black people on both sides of the Atlantic. The Anti-Slavery Reporter, originally founded by Zachary Macaulay in 1825, was by 1830 edited by Thomas Pringle, who was also secretary of the Anti-Slavery Society. The Anti-Slavery Reporter gathered up accounts from people in the Caribbean and detailed accounts from abolitionists on the ground, including the testimonies of enslaved and free Black people. So this was how the voices of enslaved and free Black people in the Caribbean permeated across the Atlantic through an abolitionist literature. The opening of Mary Prince's history there, it has a frontispiece and it has this quotation from William Cowper, who was known well as an abolitionist poet in England, and the appeal was to a British audience to push the British people to push their MPs and their representatives to pass the Emancipation Act. In 1807, Britain had passed the abolition of the slave trade, which banned people being ferried across the Middle Passage to the Caribbean, but the status of people throughout the British colonies still remained as chattel status. So Mary Prince's history was one of the most important parts of the push to ask the British public to pass the Emancipation Act. And she's commemorated in many different ways today. In 2012, she was made into a Bermuda national hero. She was born in Bermuda, and this is one of the medals. Mary Prince's story, we are told, was direct and authentic. And this was a plaque, again, to capture the sort of Black Atlantic. This is in London, the London Borough of Camden, a plaque that was set up in October 2007 to commemorate Mary Prince. So although her story was quite a small and slim volume, it actually was quite impactful and important. Within the war of print, on both sides of the argument, pro and anti-slavery, Prince's story was to become one of the most prominent in this final period of emancipationist action, and it would lead to the overthrow of British slavery in 1833. And I think it's always worth remembering how extraordinary that overthrow was, because it seemed impossible at the time, but it was achieved. Now, Mary Prince had been brought by the Woods, who were her legal owners, from Antigua in 1828 to Britain, and she had to leave behind her husband Daniel James, who was a free man, and the rest of her extended family. And she hoped that when she got to England, previous laws passed by Mansfield and Stowell, which said that once you're in England, you are free, she hoped that that would allow her to push more for her full freedom and allow her to return home to her husband. However, though nominally free in England, she was not free to return home under colonial or English law, and so Prince commenced her long battle in print that would transform the climate of anti-slavery activism in London. In her history, which was transcribed by a white woman writer, Susanna Strickland, Prince tells us the story of her life. Born in Bermuda in around 1787 or 8, she was bought as an infant with her mother by Captain Darrell and then given to his granddaughter, Betsy Williams. She was hired by Captain John Ingham when she was still a child, and then she worked for Robert Darrell at Grand Turk Island in the salt harvest ponds when she was only around 12 to 16 years old. She was then sold again to John Adam Wood in 1815, who brought her to Antigua, where she undertook a large amount of domestic work for the Woods. So a lot of movement, a lot of separation, a lot of different types of work that don't always get covered in histories of slavery. At every stage, Prince experiences and witnesses unbridled violence at the hands of British enslavers, and her story is a short but horrifying account that shocked the domestic audience and made a vital impact in the decades of anti-slavery propaganda. As Prince tells her readers in the early narrative, it was then my heavy lot to weep, 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 and that for years, to pass from one misery to another, and from one cruel master to worse. And yet, Prince's narrative is not only about her as an individual, but it is part of what Babacar Mbaye calls an African web of cultural survivals and Pan-Africanist sensibilities. Babacar Mbaye tells us that these stories cross the Black Atlantic, and Cedric Robinson in Black Radicalism asks us to consider these kinds of stories as part of Black radicalism. Quote, not a variant of Western radicalism, whose proponents happen to be Black. Rather, it is a specifically African response to oppression, emerging from the determinants of European development in the modern era and framed by orders of exploitation woven into the interstices of European social life from the inception of Western civilization. And I think that's what's really important for us thinking about Black Atlantic lives, is that they're forced to speak through the forms of Western civilization, but they are extrinsic to those forms. And the freedom that Mary Prince is asking for, the freedom that Equiano was asking for, it's a different type of freedom to the freedom that Britain and Europe legislate for. And that's where the tension comes in. Now, the point is that Prince is writing and speaking, and her narrative is being transcribed within a wider web of Black diasporan prints, petitions, testimonies, court cases, and all grounded in experiential knowledge and in activist-originated epistemologies and ontologies that we should bring to the fore when we think about this time. This web of print is rooted in the oral and the testimonial, gathering accounts and narratives that urge Black freedom. So I think, although I've said this is print culture, we have to disrupt that immediately and say that these are oral testimonies that make their way into Western print culture, and to think about those relationships. And Equiano's narrative itself is really very much saying, this is a full autobiography. But he himself embeds testimonies from his Caribbean brothers and sisters in his narrative. So Mary Prince has much to tell us about her exploitation, and this is Babacar Mbaye, who's also part of the event on Equiano. This is one of his ways of thinking about this Pan-African activism crossing the Black Atlantic in his book, The Trickster Comes West. Mary Prince links her abolitionism to other abolitionist arguments made by people like Belinda Sutton, Alado Equiano, Grace Jones, who was another woman slave who tried to push for her freedom, Onatabo Kuguano, and many others are of vital importance today as we continue to seek pathways out of ongoing racial capitalist violence. So Mbaye notes that Prince repeatedly draws on family bonds that perform tactics of resistance that are similar to those of the spider and rabbit figures in folktales of Antigua, Bermuda, and West Africa. And these rhetorical devices are part of the folklore that cross the Middle Passage. So in Mary Prince's history, she's often answering back, or she's using the space of the narrative to give her version against her owners, the Woods. And this is very undermining and subversive of the dominant narrative. But even before the publication of the history, Prince had participated in another form of print resistance that many people on both sides of the Atlantic had used to sue for their freedom. Black petitions were already a core part of wider transatlantic petitioning drives by abolitionist societies and groups that had been enormously successful in changing the law. So if we think back to, obviously very much a pre-digital society, how was public opinion gathered? This is one of the petitions that were passed that was gathered in Manchester, and you can see this is where print culture is, or written culture is interesting, the physical gathering up of names. And apparently this particular document is 5 meters long, and so these were constantly being gathered up and submitted to the legislature. In 1788, another petition, the Manchester Abolition Committee, had initiated the first mass petition drive of the movement, and they gathered up almost 100,000 signatures, again to show that the people did not support the British government. Prince's own petition was filed with British Parliament on the 24th of June in 1829. So this is a record in the parliamentary record of the submission of Mary Prince's own petition. And it specifically highlighted her own plight. But of course, it was linked to millions of enslaved people as part of Black Atlantic resistance to overthrow slavery everywhere. While petitions were organised by abolitionists, it was Black people's push for freedom and the physical battles they fought that gave a reforming European culture its sharpest articulations of what really ideals of liberty and equality would mean. Now, Prince's, and I think we can think today of how petitions operate. We're still using petitions as a way to register opposition to oppressive state mechanisms. Equiano includes his own petition within his interesting narrative, and that's an interesting embedment of his petition, that he sees his own petition again as part of this story. So Black print culture has the petition embedded within itself very early on, and so he again is speaking on for his freedom, but on behalf of millions of my African countrymen. So this is how we can think of these stories as part of the wider web of Black Atlantic literature. Equiano's petition was presented to the wider public in 1789, and then this also came on the back of another petition, which was actually, again, a hybrid type of text that was written by Ottabo Cugoano. Now, this image on the right that you see is sometimes used to represent Olaudah Equiano, but in fact, it's more likely to have been Ottabo Cugoano, because if you look at the person here and the frontispiece of Equiano's interesting narrative, they're not the same person. And so this is more likely to be Ottabo Cugoano. And he had published really an abolitionist tract, but it was presented as a petition to the British public as thoughts and sentiments on the evil and wicked traffic of slavery. And Cugoano is very explicit that slavery is just theft, and he's absolutely clear. Robbers of men, kidnappers, ensnarers, slaveholders take away the common rights and privileges of others to enrich themselves. They are universally detestable wretches. So it's a powerful read, and I really recommend that reading this tract if you haven't. So, as Cugoano says, white freedom is forged out of Black enslavement, and this revelation provided a bedrock within British Black print for insisting that capitalism was racist, and that it had to be untangled from Black labour, that the economic system that Britain had evolved had to be separated from the capture of Black labour. And then just to go back a bit further, even before Equiano in 1773, a Boston Committee of Slaves petition, this is what they called it, Peter Bestays, Sambo Freeman, Felix Holbrook, and Chester Droit in 1773 submitted their petition to underlie the sublime ideal of freedom that they wanted for themselves. And it was Dorothy Porter, who was a Howard University librarian and archivist, who found this petition and presented it in her book. So that's Dorothy Porter. Another petition had been filed in the United States by an enslaved woman, Belinda Sutton, in 1783. She had and then there are several versions of her petition, in fact. So you can go on to the Massachusetts Archive and have a look at the varying versions of it. But she had appealed to the Massachusetts General Court. And in her petition, Sutton explicitly sues for financial reparations, anticipating the prince's petition, highlighting her role as a labourer without compensation. Sutton's petition is a powerful first-person narrative that poetically is forceful and articulates the horrors of slavery. So I just want to wrap up and say that Mary Prince's history, the history of Mary Prince, is part of this wider web of Black Atlantic print oral culture, and Equiano's narrative is part of that too. And that these documents and these voices are part of a Black Atlantic futurity that asks us to keep remembering what freedom means for the Black diaspora today. I will pass on now to my colleague, Nicole.
Okay, hi. That was really good. So I just will kind of take you through some of the things that I was trying to do in my article. I was trying to really give students the language for understanding the Caribbean, not so much as a space of play, because that is something that we tend to think of the Caribbean as like a resort, right? As like a really beautiful place that we spend a lot of time in. And so I wanted to give them the language. And the way that I do that is I use art. One thing I showed them was Tessa Mars, some of her work. She is a Haitian author, a Haitian artist who does this kind of work. I don't see the one that I was specifically referencing on here in my article, but I will point to this. This is one of her pieces where it's called Invite a Dictator to Tea. And I'm trying to, she actually has a moment where she blogs about it. And I think one of the challenges that we have when we're talking about slavery is students think it's so far ago and they think it's so long ago and they think it's like such a non-modern thing. But when you go to her website, you'll see she has her artwork there, right? And she also does a little bit of blogging about it, right? And she talks about what it's like to live under or to be born under Jean-Claude. And then to also, she talks about Duvalier, right? So she talks about her art and she situates it in the sense of her listening to her family tell her about what it was like, right, during this particular time. And so she conceptualizes it. So one thing I want to do with students is for them to think of the Caribbean as a space of work, right? As a space, as a modern space and as a dystopia, right? Not as this utopia, which it is often conceptualized. And one thing I also wanted my students to think about with Mary Prince was, what does it mean when you can't go back home, right? I think this is what makes her a very contemporary figure and makes us able to contextualize her within the space of modern discussions about the border crisis, about this idea that we have illegals, right? I'm in Texas, so I hear that word a lot. But one thing we know is that our Chicana feminists, Ansel Dua often said, you know, you can't be illegal, right? If you can't, the border crossed us, right? We didn't cross the border, right? It's something that is said here often, and it is a rallying cry for thinking about imaginary lines that are drawn between people and that separate people. So I try to get my students to think about this idea of longing, and that is what makes Mary Prince a very modern figure, because she can't go back home. I also, if we're thinking about Equiano, I also think his multiple crossings, right? He goes from Nigeria to Britain, to the Caribbean to Britain, right? In the same way that Mary Prince, right, has multiple crisscrossings across across the Caribbean, and so I think in as well as England. So I think of her as a modern figure. I think of her as someone who can be recuperated for discussions that are currently happening, in the ways that immigrants are seen negatively and are seen as illegals, and also for the ways that we only focus, it seems, on a particular immigrant, right? We don't think about other immigrants specifically within the context of anti-Blackness, specifically within the context of Haitianism. So those are some things that I wanted to cover, and those are some ways that I try to bring it all into focus. So yes. And I think I will pass it off to Kristina.
Thank you so much, Nicole. So I found actually, Nicole, your essay to be incredibly helpful and generative. And I think, so I don't know if you've already mentioned this already, Kerry, in some of your opening remarks. I don't think you did, which is that so Nicole and I are part of this pedagogical section of Afro-Bane Online. And we wrote these essays along with Kerry. And so it was really wonderful to dialogue with your essay, Nicole, since we were in the same issue of Afro-Bane Online. And my remarks today are framed around three things. First thing is really like a recap of what I was trying to do with that essay, and in thinking about what I've learned over the years from thinking and teaching the history of Mary Prince. The second thing is actually kind of thought alongside Nicole's essay, and I actually zeroed in on the shift as the sort of mechanism for bringing in different histories and cultural contexts into the classroom. And I found that very, very productive. And the third thing is situating the history of Mary Prince in the kind of wider conversation around the Black Atlantic as a model for thinking about the mutually constitutive, to use a Paul Gilroy phrase, of cultural formations throughout the Atlantic world. So this is really like a thank you to both Kerry's prompt to get us to think about the history of Mary Prince, and then also Nicole's essay for reminding me of the different kind of not just different geographies, but the chronotrope, to think about time differently, to think about the history's dialogue with our modern day art pieces. So the first thing, what I tried to do in my essay is foreground the self-reflexive metacritical approach, which is just another way of saying getting my students to understand that we need to do a lot of work in terms of understanding our limitations, especially in a U.S. context. Especially if you go through the public schooling system here, we have to do a lot of work to meet the history of Mary Prince where it's at. And that public schooling does not necessarily give us the sort of global picture of that is actually required for thinking about how extraordinary Mary Prince's story is. At the same time, the hard thing about teaching this text is that there are these really difficult, violent histories, and there's a way that it can be so incredibly overwhelming to kind of come in and be like racial capitalism, right? Settler colonialism. These are not necessarily automatic terms that students may feel fluent in. I think things are changing now, especially with each fall. I am impressed with the students like literacies, political literacies, and cultural literacies. However, there's still a great deal of work to be done. And so one of the things that I try to do is foreground the imbalance, the power imbalance that is embedded in the history of Mary Prince, and kind of foregrounding the difference between the editorial materials and the account itself, and to demonstrate that the editorial materials actually can help us think about the ways in which there are different kind of hierarchies, power dynamics through which Prince had to negotiate in order to articulate her story and her testimony. And so the article tries to demonstrate how through close reading we can foreground that imbalance, and also at the same time, by seeing that power imbalance, that the text itself is highly mediated and fragmented, and because there are those fragments, it prompts the reader to kind of reflect on what they don't know, and also to reach for different kinds of literacies, like the kind and other art forms from generated from the Caribbean, as a way to kind of rethink and also alter that kind of distorted image that is produced of Mary Prince through the abolitionist kind of sentimentalizing of her experiences. So that's the first thing. So in the second thing that I want to do is just focus on that image of the ship that that Nicole writes very beautifully in her essay. And I think the ship as both like image and symbol is so productive for students to think about, to think across national boundaries, right? To think about the ways in which the ship was this kind of connective tissue in the Atlantic world. And I myself found it, I didn't arrive to this image until I read The Black Atlantic in graduate school. And the ship was very formative and foundational for decentering dominant myths that I kind of internalized over the years through public school about the U.S. and what it said about itself. And so I think Nicole's essay in foregrounding the ship in the classroom really helps elucidate what Michelle Roughtrio puts in Silencing the Past, that the U.S. monopoly on both Blackness and racism itself was a racist plot. And so I think, and it situates and decenters the US as the focal point or the reference point. And the ship as a central image of the Black Atlantic model has been both useful for opening up the geographical context for Mary Prince. And over the years, from my conversations with graduate students, my own mentors and colleagues and students, there have been two recurring criticisms of the Black Atlantic model. And these are limitations actually that Gilroy acknowledges in his introduction. And so there's first the Black Atlantic model, there's like the matter of gender politics. And the second is this sort of inadvertent monolingual recentering of the English world. And I think that the history of Mary Prince does a really great job in terms of bringing that into the fore, the limitations of the Black Atlantic model, and also standing on its own as prompting us to think about the multilingual, the broader geographies of the African diaspora and the Atlantic world. And so, and part of this is because the imagery of ships crisscrossing the Atlantic is so often kind of, at least in our imaginations, kind of cultural imaginations, oftentimes it's like men at sea, right? And so, and thinking about the ship, and Nicole, you do this such a great job in just saying, reminding us that the ship is such an important kind of aspect of of Prince's testimony, and that she names people that she encounters, that kind of gestures to this Black Atlantic history, and also different kinds of diasporic connections encounters. And then the fact that Mary Prince's story is centers the Caribbean, it also foregrounds the importance of thinking about linguistic and cultural diversities. And these are other contexts that we would have to consider and think about and prepare ourselves to think about in our engagement with the history of Mary Prince. So the last thing that I want to talk about, for now at least, is how my essay attempts to think with alongside what Paul Gilroy calls the politics of transfiguration. And he says this on page 38 for those of you who also, you assigned the Black Atlantic in your class, Nicole. And I wonder if you talk about this section as well. This is the politics of transfiguration. Gilroy describes this as not a counter discourse, but a counterculture that, quote, defiantly reconstructs its own critical, intellectual, and moral genealogy in a partially hidden public sphere of its own. It strives in pursuit of the sublime, struggling to repeat the unrepeatable, to present the unrepresentable. It rather produces a rather different interpretive focus, pushes towards the mimetic, dramatic, and performative, end quote. So in turning to this section and thinking about the Black Atlantic and thinking about the ship, and thinking about Nicole's essay, and turning to different forms, visual forms, my essay also, I think, dialogues with yours in the sense that I would try to think about sound and performance as another dimension of the history of Mary Prince, and to think about how silencing is oftentimes an effect of structures, right? Whether it's the structures that we ourselves as readers have to go through, or the structures of interpretation that we have internalized from the kind of environments that we've been in. And the silences are sometimes ones that we ourselves are producing and or interacting with or thinking or assuming. So I'm looking forward to dialoguing with you all. Thank you so much. Oh, and I would like to turn this to Olivia.
Thank you. I am also going to be thinking kind of in some of these Black Atlantic terms, but I'm also going to take it back to the late 18th century and think a lot with Equiano and Mary Prince together, and kind of what happens when we think about their context together. So I'll take it away. Both Olivia Equiano and Mary Prince can give us invaluable insight into the experience of Black British immigrants in the latter half of the long 18th century. Now, while both focus the majority of their stories on the horrors of slavery in colonial spaces, mostly removed from UK soil, both also give crucial attention to their lives in the metropole at various points in their narratives. Now, publishing his 1789 narrative 42 years before Prince's 1831 text, we see a very different power dynamic at stake when the literate Equiano not only explains that he has written his own story, but tells us in detail about how he learned to read and write in the first place. The birth of Equiano as literate subject also goes hand in hand with his decision to make the UK his home, and that's an informed choice we see him make across the narrative. Right? At certain points, he says he wants to go elsewhere. At certain points, he says, I want to go back to the UK. Now, on the other hand, from the very beginning of Prince's narrative, we are told that Prince herself does not possess the literacy skills required to write her own narrative, and infamously that the text before us has been, quote, pruned into its present shape, end quote, presumably by Thomas Pringle and Susanna Strickland, soon to be Susanna Strickland Moody. By the end of her narrative, Mary Prince is apparently not ready to decide that the UK is home once and for all, giving us a much less detailed, and yet, as I contend, much more fraught account of her coming into her own as a Black British subject. So, in my short talk today, I will invite a comparison between the two narratives, paying special attention to their shared commitment to telling a story that begins for each in slavery and ends with a new life in Britain. I argue that multiple contexts, most especially gender, lead to the crucial disparity we see in their self-presentation as Black British subjects. But this happens, I argue, not only because these texts mean that different experiences are available to them, but also because, crucially, different literatures are available to them. So I'm going to talk a lot about literary production and literary form, too, for the next 10 minutes or so. So Black Britain's struggle in the metropole were public knowledge by the time Prince set foot in the UK, thanks to authors like Equiano, who came before her and told their stories through the medium of published narratives. In his narrative, Equiano invited his readers to think about the lives of Black Britons living in London in several instances. Now, at his very first mention of the city of London, he makes an excuse to praise Black Britons. He says, "Deformity is indeed unknown among us. Numbers of the natives of Ebo now in London may be brought in support of this assertion," end quote. And so this line pointedly reminds 18th century British readers that they need only look at the Black population of London if they wanted real-world, positive examples of Black life and culture. And his first mention of London coincides with the idea that he is a member of a Black British community, one that he feels can and should be praised by readers of any color. He apparently preempts racist attitudes that would emphasize the exceptional nature of an erudite Black man's narrative, and he takes the first opportunity to dispel the myth that he is any different from any other Black Britons. Now, gaining the literacy he needs to tell his own story in the first place also takes place for him as a Black British immigrant. He tells this story too. Two white British women, the Miss Guerins, have influence over the man who legally owns Equiano, and these sisters insist on his education. He explains, quote, I had long wished to be able to read and write, and for this purpose I took every opportunity to gain instruction, but had made as yet very little progress. However, when I went to London with my master, I soon had an opportunity of improving myself, which I gladly embraced. Shortly after my arrival, he sent me to wait upon the Miss Guerins, who had treated me with much kindness when I was there before, and they sent me to school. It is at their house, too, that he becomes a member of the Church of England through baptism. And he talks about the moment where he starts to believe he's going to be damned if he's not baptized. The sisters insist upon it, and they call in a favor that the man who understands himself to own Equiano is indebted to their brother. So they call in the favor and they get him baptized. And I think it's actually quite crucial when he tells us about that baptism. He says, I was baptized in St. Margaret's Church, Westminster, in February 1759 by my present name. The clergyman at the same time gave me a book called A Guide to the Indians, written by the Bishop of Sodor and Man. Now, that's going to matter in a minute. Equiano thus explains to his readers that some of his core memories of growing up took place in Britain, and remembers Britain as the place of his awakening as both a reading subject and a Christian subject, both of which will be crucial to the rest of the narrative. And if we read this story, both as a narrative of what happens to Equiano, as well as a rather self-conscious account of how he came to write it in the first place, so a story that kind of starts with his desire to read, tells us about his gradual acquisition of more learning, and then eventually his desire to put his own words to paper, Britain takes on an even more important symbolic role in the story as the first place that makes achieving that initial desire possible. His relationship with the UK, and with the City of London in particular, is, however, not uncomplicated. After all, the Guerin sisters have only a very limited ability to check his legal owner's authority by insisting on his education and later baptism, and then only because they call in that favor. They have no power to stop Equiano's legal owner from taking him out of school, which he of course does, takes him back on board a ship, and continues to force Equiano to perform whatever labor he chooses for years to come. Equiano also hints at the fraught power dynamics at work in his baptism in sharing the title of that book on that day. When Equiano refers to the Guide to the Indians written by the Bishop of Sodor and Man, he most likely references the 1759 publication of the late Bishop Thomas Wilson's tract. The full title of that tract is The Knowledge and Practice of Christianity Made Easy to the Meanest Capacities, or an essay towards the instruction of the Indians. While the British bishop explains in his preface to the tract that his primary intended audience is actually Native Americans, the point of writing the essay is to prove that there is a way for him to educate even those subjects whom he imagines to be the most intellectually limited. It is at this point he gives special attention to people of African descent, multiple times, and using the kind of phrasing I choose not to repeat here. Now, we can also read Equiano's authorship and publication of his own narrative, then, as a direct challenge to this kind of power dynamic, one that invites him to literacy and education only with the caveat that even someone like you can be a Christian. Right? That's the power dynamic he's presented with the same moment he becomes a Christian. While he may be allowed to join the religion, the invitation does not necessarily extend to becoming a full and equal member of the community. On the contrary, it carefully polices and limits his belonging. I contend, then, that this moment is of similar importance to that of the much more famous early example of what Henry Louis Gates Jr. dubs the trope of the talking book. Now, Gates describes this metaphor as the first repeated and revised trope of the tradition of Black British and later African American letters, to be signified upon, right? This kind of game, this kind of play on each other's words, riffing on each other's use of a very important metaphor. Gates goes on, the paradox of representing, of containing somehow, the oral within the written, precisely when oral Black culture was transforming itself into a written culture, proved to be of sufficient concern for 5 of the earliest Black autobiographers to repeat the same figure of the talking book that fails to speak. Gates cites James Ukasawa-Granyosa, John Merritt, John Jay, Audubon Equiano, and of course our very own Equiano that we are thinking about today. And these are the kind of founding fathers of that tradition. In Equiano's case, the trope becomes the beginning of his story, of his longing for literacy, when he tells us about a moment before he ever sets foot in the UK, enslaved on board a ship. And Equiano tells us, quote, I had a great curiosity to talk to the books as I thought they did, and so to learn how all things had a beginning. For that purpose I have often taken up a book and have talked to it, and then put my ears to it, when alone, in hopes it would answer me. And I have been very much concerned when I found it remained silent. We can thus trace a trajectory in the talking book moment. Equiano longs for literacy. In the moment of the baptism, he gets that, but when the book at last talks to him through his literacy, it shuts him out of a community. When he writes a book of his own, however, complete with popular speaking tour of his own, but crucially, he goes around the country speaking to others. He insists on the withheld belonging and talks back using both literary and oral forms. But back to Mary Prince. Where do we locate her? Prince's tradition does not include the trope of the talking book, nor a moment of being presented with her first book as a gift. Others write her story for her and promise that it's as close to her own voice as can possibly be legible to a readership that is already assumed to be white. We cannot read her narrative as an insistence on belonging or talking back in quite the same way. Not to say we can't do that at all, but maybe not in quite the same way. She would not go on a speaking tour to accompany her book, though her body and voice would of course be placed under racist scrutiny from the moment of her narrative's publication, also in a very different way. Now, her narrative, of course, comes to us with a very different set of circumstances from those we see in Equiano's history, not least of which is she is a woman in ill physical health. She doesn't have the same opportunity or potential to perform extra labor, save up, and buy her own freedom. A lot of the things that happen to Equiano just don't happen to her in her time and place over 40 years later. But I'd also like us to think about the literary here as being quite important. Looking at Equiano and Prince together also gives me another flourish of rage and frustration towards the power dynamics at work in Pringle's and Strickland's pruning, that apparently cuts Prince right out of the possibility of joining her own literary tradition. Their control over her financial and personal security in the UK ends up extending to control over her literary form, and their co authorship and co optation of her narrative does not make room for much of any of the kind of signifying we see Equiano able to do. Who knows what kinds of tropes would have been present in that literary form if that literary form had been entirely hers to control. Black British experience similarly does not go hand in hand with literacy for her in the same way, and we may well cite this as yet another reason she ends her narrative hoping one day she will go back to Antigua, where she would be reunited with her dear husband, own country, and all old friends and connections. End quote. But perhaps we can also read this ending to her narrative as the greatest possible reclamation of power and voice available to her under her own particular circumstances. She ends the narrative with both a longing to leave Britain and a warning to white British readers not to be deceived by pro slavery lies. As others write and prune her story for her, they cannot and do not invite her into a British community, black or otherwise, nor grant her access to the same literary world of Equiano. At least that's not what we see on the page. After all, though, that invitation isn't really theirs to extend, and I think that that's also crucial as we think about the limits of literary form here. Prince herself, however, still tells us where she wants to go and what she wants us to know. Having lived and thought and worked in the same London in which Equiano was given a racist tract for a baptismal gift, 42 years later, Mary Prince ends her narrative with the idea that the people she has met in Britain are in desperate need of re-education, and ultimately that, given the chance, she will take her fate into her own hands and will use that power to go back to a community in which she does feel love and belonging on the other side of the Black Atlantic. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, and I think we've got so many amazing connections. It'll just be hard to keep them. So many things opened up there. I'm going to go back to Nicole's idea of Prince as a figure of modernity because it seems to capture a whole lot of what people are saying, that she's in exile, that she can't go home, that she is both inside these state boundaries of Britain, but isn't even connected to Black Britain in the way that Equiano was to the Sons of Africa, as you're saying, Olivia. And also this idea of the ship. Kristina, what she really wants to do is get back on a ship as a sovereign subject, as her own belonging to herself. So I just wondered if you had any more thoughts on this idea of Prince as a figure of modernity. And I think, Nicole, as you say, gesturing forward to the lives lived by current people trying to get in from Haiti, or, we can see the conflicts, the genocides in Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and just how Black life is always being excluded from the forms of modernity while experiencing the very harshest aspects of it.
Right. I think as Olivia was talking, and she was talking about silencing, right? And how Mary Prince is silenced in multiple ways, and how it can also create this like self-silencing that you do. So I also think in terms of Mary Prince being a modern subject, it's also about how she's silenced, how she's oppressed, right? This idea that oppression is what's universal and oppression is what is modern. So that's the way that I was conceptualizing of her. And I think Olivia's talk also helped me to think about her silencing and her gendered silencing, right? That is, and she's silenced in multiple ways by white women, right? So it's very interesting, which I think opens her up to thinking about the silencing of Black women in current spaces, right? So I think it opens up that discussion.
Any other thoughts on that idea of, nation boundaries and I think, Christine, a lot of what you're highlighting out of Nicole's essay on the Black wanderer as a figure captures that main tension, that yes, the ship is the connective tissue between states, but it's always another space. And a space of, if we think of Christina Sharp's In the Wake, a space of monumental oppression, as Nicole's saying, but also a possibility for some kind of, as you're saying, Olivia, the freedom that Prince gets, and the freedom sometimes, Equiano earns his freedom, earns the physical money to buy himself, to get his emancipation. He earns that money on ships.
I mean, one of the things that struck me about this kind of discourse of the modern as well, especially when we're talking to students, but we think of the modern at this point, depending how we're defining the term modern, if the modern has a history that goes back at least a couple of centuries by now, but sometimes maybe students tend to think of the phenomenon of a white woman will speak up for a black subject or something like that as being a particularly kind of contemporary phenomenon. But Strickland Moody tells us that this has at least a 200-year history, right? That we open this whole narrative. The whole point of the narrative, kind of telling the story of its own creation, has been totally co-opted. We hear Thomas Pringle and Susanna Strickland's words before we ever see anything from Mary Prince on the page. And Equiano has some of those same kinds of limitations, but not in quite the same way, right? Like there's a different modernity he's able to access, and it's decades earlier than hers. But it matters that he's a man. It matters that he isn't experiencing the same kinds of illness and physical disability that she's experiencing. It matters just kind of who's helping him and who's not or what. But this idea of having to compete for that these two literary figures would even have to compete for resources at all, right? That they would, not that they directly compete with each other, but I mean that he gets one story of getting to tell his own story, and she gets another, and who knows how much more similar what they would have to say would be if you actually could sit these two people down and ask them, but that's lost to us for literary reasons as much as it's lost to us for a whole host of other reasons as well.
And the literary as a technology of modernity as well. And I think that
Yeah.
paradox, though, is that what I'm trying to show is that the petitions are exactly that fraught boundary of we are representing ourselves, but we have to represent ourselves through these channels because you're oppressing us so appallingly, and so we get these like fragmented voices. But I do think petitions are a paradox in the sense that they gather community while they are the voices that are excised from the state narratives. So it's, yeah. And I was thinking about what you were saying, Kristina, as well, about our students. If we think of them today within modernity, I mean, a lot of what you're saying is the narratives students get on both sides of the Atlantic and in Nigeria about the nation state, and that those narratives preclude the possibility of fully coming to Equiano or Prince with an understanding of what their lives were like. Maybe we could think about that a bit more.
Yeah, I think the question I was actually just reflecting on, the we, who's the we that's reading this. And I think that that's also something to foreground in a text in an undergraduate classroom. And I want to return to that kind of wonderful thread that is coming out of this conversation between you, Olivia, and Nicole, which is literature as its own form of like technology of modernity that does its own form of disciplining. And I think it's important to kind of see that fragmentation within by looking at the kind of imbalance between the kind of editorial material and the account itself, within the publication of the history of Mary Prince, to see that imbalance as not necessarily uh, it's not so far away, that those fragmentations and imbalances that we see in that text are actually indicative of the kinds of structures that we move through. And I again, the we in the scare quotes, because we arrive to texts with all different kinds of histories and different kinds of understandings of power. And I think the longer I sit with the history of Mary Prince, and the more I dialogue with other people like you all about this work, I see this really as a text that prompts us to develop literacies that kind of come out of that desire to grapple with the fragmentation, but not necessarily make it legible to our own sorts of I mean, I don't like using the word ideological formation, but like what I mean is, the kinds of our, just to understand that we come that to speak about myself, like I know that I have a lot of bias because as an instructor, and I foreground that bias to my students, and I invite my students to think about what kinds of bias that might inform their readings of the text too. And also, I think the other thing too is to that sometimes it's not to kind of produce a resolved reading of the history of Mary Prince, but to always see it as like a kind of constant dialogue, a dialogue with a text that the fragmentations insist that we keep reckoning with the silences and the gaps and the kinds of our own realizations of the gaps that we also carry in our understanding of the world, because it can be so overwhelming to kind of come, like I find it very overwhelming to come in and be like, oh, these are all the kind of structures of domination and subordination, right? And sometimes it's helpful to begin with like, well, what kind of power is at play between us and a text, any text for that matter, and what kind of meaning making happens in the gaps, so yeah. So anyways, this is just me riffing off of that really lovely thread about thinking about literariness as like a technology of the modern, and thinking about how as modern readers that we are also engaging with limitations with limitations of the scale of these structures of domination. So,
and I wonder if we can link, that's wonderful, Kristina, of those ideas to the categories that Nicole raised of legal, illegal, because this, both are writing to become legal in some way, or speaking to be legal. So that the literary, such as it is, or the oral literary is, and the petitions are connected to undoing one's status as a legal chattel and becoming a legally free subject. And if we think again of Haitian migration, but we also think of the Windrush generation in Britain currently now being illegally deported back to Jamaica and other Caribbean islands, because really the Home Office has burned lots of papers and destroyed lots of papers that authorized Black subjects to be in Britain. So if we can just think a bit more of this, yes, it's overwhelming, but as Nicole said, the Caribbean is presented to Britain and America as a utopia, but let's think of it more as the site of the dystopia. And for whom is it utopia? For whom is it dystopia? I don't know if anybody wants to feed into those thoughts.
Well, I liked, Kerry, the image that you showed of the petition with Mary Prince earlier in your talk, because there's this weird thing where it's like, you can be seen as illegal and not in this space, but you have to go through legal means. And so, we get this documentation, like I think of Sojourner Truth, who like legally files a case to get her son back, right, when he sold into slavery illegally, right? So having like these records and this archive of like the legal means that these illegal people are these non-citizens had to turn towards, and then also thinking about the ways that the law doesn't account for their citizenship, like the gaps in the law, right, where Black women can't be raped, right? It's just not, it's chattel property, so you can't rape a desk, you can't rape a chair, right? So just thinking about like the conundrums, I'm not sure if I have an answer, but just thinking about like the paradoxes that are inherent in that kind of illegal, but having to turn to legal forms. So
but I think that's why we should pay attention to these texts, because they bring our attention to the irreconcilable nonsense that is white freedom. Tyler Stovall talks about, freedom is for white people, and therein is the paradox. So, the conundrum that Prince and Equiano and Kiguano and everybody else, so Jonah Truth, they're all faced with, aren't I a woman too? Are you not, does this freedom not apply to me? And if it doesn't apply to me, then, but I can be converted, but I'm human. I mean, I was thinking when you were talking, when one of you were talking, I think it was Olivia of Phyllis Wheatley's, yeah, line, we, even though we're as black as Cain, we can join the angelic train. This, she captures the argument you're saying with Equiano.
I mean, I thought about that moment too, the kind of, even you can be one of us kind of thing that he kind of riffs off. But this, I think it matters that he has that incredibly fraught relationship with buying himself, and then tells the story of it. Mary Prince has tried to buy herself and can't, and both of them kind of tell us about this, because in a certain sense, literature was supposed to be that. Literature kind of is that disciplining space, and ways that we thought about, but it's also supposed to be the place where you can tell the story of where illegal things happen. I mean, this is happening in the fiction. I'm also currently writing about Frances Burney's The Wanderer, where there's a moment where we're in 1814 now, so this woman threatens to deport an enslaved little boy in her household back to the colonies, but of course we're so far post-Mansfield that it would be illegal for her to do this, but she seems so confident that she can. Right? It seems fairly confident that racial power gives her the ability to just straight up flout the law. But I was also thinking about, so as much when you were talking about this idea of literature and forms and kind of these alternative spaces to tell the story of where all the illegal things are happening. And as well, I think I was really, really struck by Nicole when you showed the image of the tea set from the artist. And I saw the image of the tea set, and then you turned to the blog and you could see, based on, I think, the shape of her fingernails, how tiny the tea set is, and that she can hold the tea set in the palm of her hand. And something about that and this idea of kind of the power dynamics of making a human illegal, and then being able to try to represent some of that in a tea set that could be held in the palm of the hand, that there was actually something incredibly special about moving to that particular art form, about also moving away from the literary, or trying to put an art form you can hold in the palm of your hands in conversation with the literary. Because in that moment of her beautiful fingernails holding onto that tea set, something really powerful happened, and I kind of had this chills down my spine moment where sometimes I was actually feeling quite sad in preparing my talk, as much as I tried to end on a kind of triumphant note for Prince, because I do think she deserves that moment of celebration just as much as she deserves my frustration and rage at how she was treated. But then I got to also see these fingernails holding onto this tea set, and I think that really matters too in talking back to this idea of the illegal human being, or of the idea that illegal things are going to be happening all the time, and maybe literature can tell that story, but there's not that much you can do about it. I don't know, being able to just pick up that tea set feels like a stand-in for being able to kind of do something, and maybe art can give us some of that too.
And especially when we think of the sort of nothingness that all this labor was for, sugar, tea, not essential aspects of life. Well, I wonder if anybody has any final thoughts before we bring our discussion to a close. I think we've given some very rich ideas and reading materials that could accompany this session. We'll upload some of the materials that we've discussed will be available for everybody to look at. Any closing thoughts? Okay, well, I think, that ending when Mary Prince says, to be free is very sweet. I want to be free, but to be free is very sweet. Is a pun on that, on sugar as sweetness, but it's also to be free, as in, if one were the tense of it, I would like to be free, but I am not free. But I know in my imaginings that to be free is very sweet. So that maybe captures the tensions that we're discussing. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I really enjoyed this conversation.